For nearly 30 years, one question has refused to disappear from hip hop. Who killed Tupac Shakur? Now, I'm going to take you back on a little trip. On September 7th, 1996, Tupac was riding through Las Vegas with Death Row Records boss Suge Knight when a night Cadillac pulled alongside their BMW. Then gunshots came. Tupac was hit four times. Okay. Then 6 days later, one of the most influential rappers in history was dead. All right. For almost 3 decades, there was no trial, no conviction, and no courtroom where a jury could finally hear the evidence. But now that has changed because nearly 30 years after Tupac's death, a man accused of helping orchestrate the killing is finally inside a courtroom. His name is Duane Keffe. Now, here's the part that makes this case extraordinary, okay? Because the prosecution story is built in part around Keffe D's own words, but his defense says those words were exaggerated, unreliable, and essentially fiction. So after all these years, will a jury finally decide who was responsible for Tupac's death? And perhaps even more importantly, did Keffe D say too much for too many years? Let's go back to the beginning of how it all started. Now, I could remember somewhere around September 7th, 1996 in Las Vegas. Tupac Shakur had just attended the Mike Tyson versus Bruce Seldon boxing match at the MGM Grand. Yes, the MGM Grand. The atmosphere was already intense. Okay, Tupac was surrounded by members of his death row entourage, including Suge Knight. But after the fight, something happened that prosecutors say would ultimately lead to Tupac's murder. You see, Tupac and members of his group encountered the Orlando Baby Lane, and this was inside the MGM Grand, if you're following the story well. Anderson was the nephew of Duane Keffe D. Then, a physical confrontation followed. And that confrontation is now at the center of the prosecution's theory. So moving on in the story, according to prosecutors, Davis and his associates saw what happened as an act that demanded revenge. And what happened next would become one of the most famous unsolved murders in music history. Now, later that night, Tupac was riding in a BMW driven by Suge Knight. They were traveling through Las Vegas when another vehicle approached, a white Cadillac. Then suddenly, gunfire. Multiple shots were fired into the BMW. Tupac was shot 4 times, all right? Now, Suge Knight was also injured, but he survived. The attackers escaped. And the man who would eventually be accused of orchestrating the shooting wasn't even alleged to have pulled the trigger. That's an important distinction because prosecutors aren't saying Keffe D was necessarily the gunman. They're accusing him of something entirely different. Okay? Now, helping organize the attack, providing the weapon, and directing what happened, that is exactly what they're accusing him of. And that distinction could become one of the most important issues for the jury because the prosecution doesn't necessarily need to prove that Davis personally pulled the trigger. They have to convince the jury that he knowingly participated in the murder. Now, if you're following me, quickly like this video and let's continue. After Tupac died, the investigation continued, but years later, then more years, and still there was no trial, no conviction. Now, the mystery became part of hip-hop mythology because fans developed a lot of theories. Books were written, documentaries were produced. People debated whether Tupac's death was connected to the East Coast West Coast rivalry, but others believed the real story had never been fully revealed. All right. So, and while the public continued asking questions, the case remained unsolved until one man started talking a lot. Now, this is where the story gets extremely unusual. So if you're still with me up until this moment, quickly hit that subscribe button and let's move on. You see, Duane Davis had publicly discussed Tupac's murder for years. All right. His statements eventually became a major part of the renewed investigation. He talked about the night. He talked about the people involved, and he eventually became connected to a memoir titled what is the title again? I think Comptown Street Legend. Yeah, Comptown Street Legend. So to prosecutors, those statements aren't just random stories. They are admissions. The prosecution argues that Davis essentially described his own involvement, but the defense has a completely different interpretation. They say Davis was known to exaggerate. You see, they argue that some of his public statements were made for entertainment reasons, attention, or money. And that creates one of the biggest questions of the entire trial. When someone talks about a crime for years, how does a jury determine which parts are true? Because saying something publicly doesn't automatically make it legally proven. And that's exactly what the defense wants jurors to remember. Okay? And then there's this interview that could become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. Somewhere around 2008, David spoke with law enforcement. His defense challenged whether that interview should be allowed to be used against him. But a Nevada judge ruled that prosecutors could use a Nevada judge ruled that prosecutors could use the interview as evidence. Alright? But that decision matters because prosecutors can now put Davis' earlier words in front of the jury. But that means jurors won't simply hear what Davis says today. Okay? They can compare it with what he said years ago. Imagine sitting on that jury. You are listening to a man accused of helping orchestrate one of the most famous murders in American music history. Then you hear recordings of statements that he made years before his arrest. The question becomes, was he confessing or was he telling a story? Give me a minute. Let me write something down. Thank you. Now, you see, that distinction could determine everything. Like everything. Moving on in this story, the prosecution's argument is relatively straightforward. They say this wasn't a random shooting. They say it was retaliation. They allege the motive. The confrontation involving Orlando Anderson at the MGM Grand. Prosecutors argue that Davis became the organizer of the retaliation. They say he helped obtain the gun and participated in the planning. And then the Cadillac followed Tupac's BMW. The shooting happened and Tupac died 6 days later. Prosecutors are now asking a jury to connect those events. And that's something else that makes their case difficult because almost 30 years have passed. People who were there are dead. Memories have faded. And much of the physical evidence from 1996 is not the kind of evidence you would expect to find in a modern trial. If I could, sorry for that. But that gives the defense an opening, and they are taking it. This is why they are taking it. Davis has pleaded not guilty. His defense says the prosecution is taking decades, old statements, and treating them as undeniable truth. But the defense wants the jury to ask, where is the physical evidence? Where is the weapon? Where is the direct eyewitness who say, I saw Keffe D order Tupac's murder? That's the problem prosecutors face. Now, some witness can provide information about what happened around the shooting. But according to current reporting, key witnesses do not simply provide a clean eyewitness identification or Davis as the shooter. And remember, Davis isn't accused of being the gunman anyway. The prosecution's theory is that he was the organizer. So this trial isn't simply about did Keffe D pull the trigger? No, it's about something much bigger. Did Keffe D knowingly help make Tupac's murder happen? All right. I think I'm going too fast. So think about what this means. Tupac died in 1996. The world has changed dramatically since then. The internet was barely beginning to enter everyday life. Social media didn't exist. Streaming didn't exist. Entire generations have grown up listening to Tupac without ever seeing him alive. Yet his music remains influential. His death remains one of the most discussed mysteries in hip-hop. And now, for the first time, a jury is being asked to examine the case through the evidence presented in court. No documentaries, No internet theories, not even social media reports, not fan speculation, no evidence. That is what makes this moment so significant. But there's one question hanging over this entire trial. If Keffe D's own words are so important, can the jury trust them? Because this case has an unusual twist. The prosecution is essentially saying, listen to what the defendant himself said. The defense is saying, don't believe everything he said. Now, the jury has to decide. That's a fascinating legal battle, because sometimes the most powerful evidence isn't a photograph or a DNA sample. Sometimes it's someone's own words. But words can also be misunderstood. People can exaggerate, people can lie, people can tell stories, and people can change their stories over time. The jury has to determine which one happened here. Well, for almost 3 decades, Tupac's mother existed in a strange space between reality and mythology. These were theories, there were accusations, there were documentaries, there were songs, there were interviews, but there was no verdict. Now, there's finally a courtroom. Keffe D is facing the jury. The prosecution says he helped orchestrate Tupac's murder as retaliation. The defense says the government's case relies too heavily on unreliable statements and flawed investigation. And somewhere in the middle is the truth. The truth about what happened that night in Las Vegas. The truth about who planned it. The truth about who supplied the weapon. And ultimately, who should be held responsible for Tupac's death. But there's another reason this trial is so compelling. You see, because if the jury accepts the prosecution's arguments, it could finally provide a legal answer to a mystery that has haunted hip-hop for generations. And if the defense succeeds, the biggest question surrounding Tupac's death could remain unanswered. After nearly 30 years, we are finally getting closer to that answer. But the trial has only just begun. You see, and as testimony continues, the evidence could become even more explosive, because the man prosecutors say helped organize the killing has already spent years talking about it. Now, those words are being played back in a courtroom, and this time a jury is listening. You see, if you want to understand what really happened to Tupac, don't just listen to rumors. Watch what happens inside that courtroom, because after 30 years, the Tupac Shakur murder case is no longer just a mystery. It's now a trial, okay? So, if you really want to follow more updates on this Tupac Shakur courtroom trial, and to finally know whether he's gonna get justice, don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to like, and I'd love to know what you think in those lovely minds of yours in the comment section down below. I'll be seeing you on the next update. Peace.